Good to see all of you tonight. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to start a new study this evening. I'll apologize to the Bible class teachers. They're going to be switching up here soon. We switch our classes generally in January, the very first Sunday of January, or the first Sunday of any quarter, I guess I should say, when we do that. And I was really hoping I would extend this series to where we would start when after the change. But anyway, if they can go back and watch the video if they need to hear the introduction to the study of James, because I want to jump into the study of James tonight, because we have finished up on Sunday our study on Gather Your Own Straw. I'll make a couple brief comments about the study. I handed out the lesson sheets on Sunday night. If it works for you, fine. I had a couple folks mention that it was the print was a little small, and if that's the case with you, just catch me afterwards. I made a few copies of a little larger print. If you need that, just catch me on the way out of the building. I'll swap it out for you. And if you go onto our website, then you can download the material as well out of the book of James. You can download the material and catch it that way as well, both in PDF, and I actually threw the Word document on the website as well for those who like to type in answers and manipulate it that way. This is my material, so I don't copyright anything. I don't publish anything in that sense, and so for anybody at home, free to use it, share it, send it wherever you want to send it. It's perfectly fine as we use this lesson sheets, and they're just really questions as we move through the study. But before I get any further, now that we've got all that out of the way, if you would, let's bow our heads together. We'll share in a word of prayer, and then we'll jump into this study together this evening. Our Father in heaven, thank you for blessing us and caring for us and loving us and allowing us even this opportunity to open our Bibles, to appreciate your testimony, to learn more of your will, and to make application of this great text written by James. Thank you for sharing it with us and the inspiration behind it, and we know your knowledge is being revealed to us and the encouragement and valuable lessons we can gain through this study. Strengthen us in our endeavor, not just tonight, but throughout our series. Guide us and give us purpose in that, and we pray all these things through thy Son's name. Amen. Now, I mentioned a couple weeks ago when I said this is where I was going to head in terms of our study. We did this series, used the exact same set of questions, by the way, so if you kept them, you have a head start. But it's the exact same material that we used 4 years ago, but we were online only 4 years ago when we did this study. So you didn't have a chance. Some of you would chime in once in a while on YouTube messaging and comments, and we'd try to do that, but you really didn't get a chance to discuss and be involved in the study of the book of James. And besides that, it was 4 years ago. If I asked you what we studied last Sunday, it would take you a minute. Let alone ask you what we did 4 years ago, it would take you longer than a minute maybe to think about. So let's come back and give you an opportunity to actually be involved in a real face-to-face conversation about this great book from James. And I wanted to just start off appreciating the very first question in relationship to that, and that is simply this: to whom was this letter written? But let me pause and ask a second question on top of that. Who wrote it? That might be a better question to start with. Okay, well, there's the obvious. Okay, good job. You're proud of it, right? James. But there's a gazillion James, right? Okay, so it could be brother of Jesus. Who else could it technically be? We'll talk about it in a minute. James Okay, there's a James the Apostle, right? And then there's James, the one they call the less, right? Son of Alphaeus. So there are a myriad of options, and the text itself doesn't necessarily give us any great insight as to which one it might be. In fact, how does the writer define himself in verse 1? Just servant of God, right? The bond servant of God, right? But he doesn't say, and a apostle like some of the epistles do. He doesn't say James, the brother of Jesus, for that matter. He doesn't give us any kind of specific indication of who it is that he is as it relates to writing this material. There are some speculative kinds of things. There's some scholarly things that you can look at that might help you understand who this might be. But a lot of folks jump pretty quickly to this is James, the brother of Jesus. Now, there are certain religious bodies that run 100 miles away from that, because there are some religious institutions that don't believe Jesus had any brothers, that he had any earthly siblings. And any text that comes up that uses that kind of language, they'll just kind of, I won't say rationalize it, but they'll kind of say, well, that word, and in some ways they're right, the word brethren, the word brother can at times be used generically, right? It doesn't always necessarily mean blood relatives. But I think there's enough evidence within the text that speak to that matter to give pretty good clarity that when you're talking about the family of Jesus, he had siblings, those who were his fleshly brothers. And it's generally understood that the author of this book is most likely his fleshly brother, James. And there's some reasons for that, and that's what I want to share with you here quickly before we get into this discussion. I want you to run over to the book of Acts for a minute. Let me just share a couple things with you, just try to give you a little bit of backdrop and so forth. Acts chapter 12. And just notice the first couple of chapters, or first couple of verses of chapter 12. So at the beginning of chapter 12 of the book of Acts, notice he said, now about that time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of whom? Brother of John, with the sword. So James, the brother of John, is whom? That's the apostle, right? James the apostle is the brother of John, the sons of Zebedee, right? So whomever wrote the book of James, if it's this man, it had to have been written pretty early on, right? Not something that would have come later down the road. It would have had to happen prior to this scene here in Acts chapter 12. It's highly unlikely, though again, the writer of James doesn't define himself very specifically, does it very generically, but highly unlikely that we're dealing with James the apostle, because the epistle would have to have come way too soon in the history, based on the fact that James dies here in the relative early portions of that history. But keep reading on in Acts chapter 12 with me for a moment, and jump down into verse 17. So verse 2 says, James the apostle has died. But notice when Peter's being dealt with here, verse 15, if you back up just a little bit, give more context. They said unto her, thou art mad. Remember, that's when Peter was in jail, and he gets out, and when the young girl hears the knock and goes and tells them Peter's outside, they don't believe it, right? But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. And he, beckoning unto them with the hand to hold their peace, declared unto them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, go show these things unto James and to the brethren. And he departed and went into another place. So here's all I can share with you. Again, you might argue, well, we still don't know who this James is, but we do know who he is not. We do know who he is not. He can't be the one that's died by the sword already, right? He can't be that one. He's got to be another one. And the general understanding, again, is that James, the brother of Jesus, had slowly began gaining influence and began working among brethren. And you see him begin to surface in conversations as it relates to various spiritual matters. Run over to Galatians chapter 1. I'll come back to the book of Acts here in a minute. But run to Galatians chapter 1, verse 19. I believe is where I want to be. So this one gets a little bit interesting, right? Paul's writing this, and he's talking about his travels. He says in verse 17, "Neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which are apostles before me, but I went into Arabia and returned again unto Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and abode with him for 15 days. But other of the apostles saw I none," and here's interesting, "save James, the Lord's brother." So we clearly, in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 19, have a James identified very specifically as James, the Lord's brother. And Paul had entreated him as if he was a what? An apostle. There's one... Well, let's think about this for just a second. And again, some of these will be easier than others, but let's start with the easiest question. How many apostles were there to start? 12, right? 12 apostles that Jesus originally chose to start with. We lose one when Judas Iscariot, right, betrays Jesus and deals with himself the way he does. But he's replaced by Matthias, right? When they've got to find something, when they're waiting for the Holy Spirit to come and they're assembled there in Jerusalem, they decide we've got to replace him, and they cast lots, and the lot, right? So we're back to 12. Then we add whom? We add Paul, right? So we'll come back to him. So we add Paul in a very peculiar purpose, right? The Apostle Paul selected to take that message of the gospel to the Gentiles, right? So he is selected as an ambassador, a messenger, which is by definition what an apostle is, for a peculiar purpose of taking the gospel message to the Gentile world. Who joins him in that process? That's your guy, right? Barnabas. And so later Barnabas is also identified as, or with the defining term at least, of an apostle. And now Paul, when he writes to those in Galatia, he identifies James, the brother of Jesus, and defines him as an apostle. That doesn't trouble me, by the way, at all. You might just view that as then we've had a total of 12, 13, 14, 15, and potentially 16 different men. Or we have the original 12 apostles who were very peculiar in the purposes that they served. You lose one, but you replace him with somebody who's going to have the exact same thought processes. Remember when you read it in Acts chapter 1, and they're defining, he's got to be somebody who's been with them since, really, baptism of Jesus, clear through the resurrection. He's got to be a legit witness. The replacement for Judas had to be somebody just like the original 11. But Paul's different. His apostleship is different. He's not simply roll with the original 12. His purposes are different. Barnabas' role was different than those original 12. James, the brother of Jesus, his role could easily be different than the original 12. Still an apostle, by the way, because the Bible uses definitive terms all the time. The Bible refers to elders, meaning those who serve in a peculiar office and work. The Bible also uses the word elders to refer to whom? Every older man, right? And so I just a little Bible study with you here, right? When you see that word apostle, don't trip over that. It can have both very specific connotation of the original 12. It could have a little added when you lost one, gain one, but still those original purposes that the original 12 had. Then you get peculiar with Paul. You get peculiar with Barnabas. Different role that James, the brother of Jesus, had. So they serve in that same ambassadorship and messenger purposes of God, but maybe different than what the original 12 might have had, but still defined and spoken of that way. And so technically within Scripture, I believe you've got 16 different men who at one point or in time or another were defined as apostles, and they all may have had various purposes and functions within that description. But all, go ahead, Randy.
He's referring to Peter as one of the apostles. Then he says the other apostles. Wouldn't that relate that to those 12?
Correct. And that's why I'm saying when he says, I saw Peter, but the other 11, the other 10, because James is, again, right? But all the other of the originals, potentially, or all of them being defined as apostles, I didn't see any of them except for James, the Lord's brother. And that's why I'm saying Paul's defining him as an apostle. The sentence doesn't make sense otherwise. And if that answers your question. Yep.
James is also mentioned in chapter 2, verse 9. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go unto the heathen, and they unto the circumcision. Then again in verse 12 it says, for before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles, but when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision.
Yeah. And that's interesting because in that context, Paul's actually backing up in history. And he's going prior to the death of James and talking about how he was initially received when he comes back in Jerusalem and how all that worked as it relates to that. And that could add even more confusion, right? Because in one minute you got James, the brother of Jesus, being referenced in Galatians chapter 1. Then Paul backs the history up even further and refers to a time where Cephas, which is Peter, and John, the apostle, and James, his brother, were still living when Paul was referring to this piece of history. But it does create challenges sometimes when you read through those texts, trying to discern which man or person you're referring to. So here's the point that I'm really trying to do a little study with you, but also just trying to though we don't know, again, I'll go back to that. The writer of James doesn't define himself for us. But all things point, right, to the brother of Jesus. And there's plenty of evidence to know that Jesus had a brother named James. And there's plenty of evidence to point that he was alive at the time. And when you start reading the book and see his audience, right? Because who's his audience? That's question one. You want to back up to that from 15 minutes ago? 12 tribes. Who are they? That's Jews. He's writing to a Hebrew audience, right? That happens a couple of times. Doesn't happen a lot. in the epistles, right? Paul wrote most of the epistles, and most of those are written to either churches that are Gentile origins and other connectivities. But Hebrews is obviously written to those of Jewish background, and James is too, which would make sense because that's his background, and he wasn't the one like Paul and Barnabas selected to really be the voice that goes into the Gentile world. And so you see that.
Are these people who become Christians along the way?
Well, I think you'll see, I think you'd have to, I think the context would illustrate that, because he's encouraging them to stay steadfast despite the count it all joy when you fall into diverse challenges and difficulties, right? So he's definitely challenging them to maintain their faith despite their peculiar, which we'll talk, but that's context we'll appreciate before we're done as it relates to that.
Would this have been written enough to be before the Gentiles?
And I mean, again, possibly, I think.
To be specifically to the Jews.
Yeah,
Jewish.
I mean, if James, the brother of Jesus, wrote it, you're probably talking about somewhere just shy of 30 years after the death of Jesus. So, around 6. So, early enough that there would still may have been primarily a Jewish audience to be spoken of, but I think you would have had Gentile churches by that point. You're not. I don't think you're pre that. But I think, and before we're done here, I think it might be more peculiar to the fact of where he seems to stay established and where he is. Where was he when Paul referenced him in Galatians chapter 1? He's in Jerusalem, right? He's in Jerusalem. And it seems that he's prevalent there, which would explain maybe why his teachings are very specific towards that Jewish community. It's interesting to note, and I'm just sharing a couple other things with you. Let me share one other text. I want to go to Acts chapter 21. So now we're even some time later, right? And Paul's referenced in Galatia about how he hadn't seen any of these other apostles except for Peter, and save James, the brother of Jesus. And notice here in Acts chapter 21, you could start in verse 17. And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us, and there goes back to that reference I made a moment ago, this is where you generally find him. And the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they had heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. And they are informed of thee, that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. And we're just doing a little history tonight. You think about that, right? What's happening is Paul's been out among the Gentiles, and generally when Paul goes into the Gentile community, he doesn't really even talk about the Old Testament law much. Why? They didn't know it. It didn't have as much relevance to them, right? You're not going to be able to make an argument to the Gentile community that they ought to believe in Jesus because here was this Old Testament law book that led you to him. They're going to have to come to conclusions about Jesus without necessarily knowing that history and background. They're going to have to see what he said, how he taught, the powers that he had, what he shared with these, right? They're going to see different things in the Gentile world. But word had gotten back to Jerusalem that Paul wasn't demanding that the Gentiles fulfill some of those very foundational Old Testament laws, particularly what? Circumcision, right? They mention that specifically. And none of the customs have. And so they say, what is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. Do therefore this that we say to thee, we have 4 men which have a vow on them. Them take and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly, and keepest the law. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Where did that come from, by the way? Right. That's the Antioch issue, right? When they had all those Judaizing teachers that had gone up there, and Paul and Barnabas got to go down in Jerusalem and have a conversation, they say, listen, this is what we've been telling the Gentiles communities ever since that point in time. Now, we could have a whole class period talking about how Paul responded to this, by the way. Fascinating, isn't it? What's Paul do in verse 26? He fulfilled the customs. Even though that Old Testament law was done away with, a new covenant has been ushered in. But Paul understood that the customs may be meaningless at this point, right? Because the law has been, the authority of the law is gone. So whether they fulfill a custom of purification or they don't, won't have any merit or detraction whatsoever between his relationship with God. And so okay, I'll fulfill your custom to be able to gain that influence. Now, we're supposed to be talking about James, aren't we? But you're right. You know, sometimes and Paul's an interesting character, right? There's one other occasion where Paul tells him, I can't stay because I got to be back in Jerusalem because the feast day's coming. I've got a feast day to observe. It's well after Jesus obviously has died. Paul comes on the scene well after the new covenant in place. But here's what's pertinent and relevant. And you can ask me those questions later. But here's what's pertinent and relevant to this. James is involved, right? James, the brother of the Lord, is acting by its definition in the role of an apostle, an elder among the men in Jerusalem. Because when Paul arrives there, who's there? When Paul goes James is there. It's not James the original apostle because he's been gone for a while. James the brother of Jesus is there, and he's involved in the leadership. He's involved in the guidance. He's involved in the knowledge and the information and the authority that those older men gathered there in Jerusalem were delivering when it came to controversial, challenging questions. And even in these difficult times, what we might even refer to as transitional times, where Jewish folks that couldn't deny what they had witnessed in Jesus, right? Many of them, they saw it, they heard it, they witnessed the miracles, they were engaged by the teachings, they had all of this connectivity that has led them to believe in Jesus. But you don't just slam on the brakes and quit everything you ever did prior to that moment when it came to the customs and traditions and the various aspects of what they did as Jewish believers. And so it was hard. And James is going to write them a letter. And he's going to say, I know it's hard. I know the tribulation and the trials that it is. He's experiencing it for himself in so many ways. Challenging to try to figure out, well, what do I tell a Gentile differently than a Jew, and is that even right? Right? Is it even right for me to, in some senses, say to a Jew, well, you need to do these 7 or 8 things, but tell to the Gentile Christian, well, you don't need to do those 7 or 8 things. And how do we balance that in this transition, right? And that's why I wanted to bring all that up. Because if we're right, and again, you might say, well, I'm still not convinced that this is James, the brother of Jesus, and that's okay. But if we're right in convincing ourselves that this is James, the brother of Jesus, that wrote this letter, then it helps us know why he's writing it. When you think about all of these things that he's experienced and seen and heard, and how does he convey a message to a troubled Jewish 12-tribe audience who needs encouraged when they feel like they're being pulled in 2 different directions. They believe in Jesus, but do I just abandon every custom that I've ever done before? And if I believe in Jesus, does that mean I'm not allowed to circumcise anymore? Because I believe in Jesus and I'm a disciple of Him, does that mean I can't have a meal during the Passover feast and invite my family into my home to observe it anymore? Right? They're struggling with that kind of thing, among other things. And James says, let me encourage you. And he writes this letter. And that to me fits the backdrop of how we can maybe appreciate the things that he writes in the book.
Couldn't it be James, the son of Alphaeus?
There doesn't seem to be any evidence to that end because you just don't see him, right? You just don't see him. But yes, theoretically, you can't just rule it out. And I don't know that there seems to be, I've not read enough evidence to be able to point to him. But plausible. Good questions. All right, now I filled your minds with all kinds of things to think about. We got all of 3 minutes, so let's... Yeah, now we've cleared all that one up. Question 1, and we won't take all 35 minutes, by the way, on every question in our lesson sheets throughout the study. But but I think it's important. If we can know a little bit about the who, know a little bit about the why, if you can grasp those things a little bit, boy, it makes things a lot clearer sometimes of what's actually being taught and said. So we know then, we've already talked about this, right? So our audience, 12 tribes, these are Jewish audience as it relates to that. So let's go into the narrative for just a minute and let's set the stage. Back to James chapter 1, if I can get there. One more. 2 more. All right. So there's a secondary question I should make sure let's at least hit it here. So he doesn't just say 12 tribes, but he said to the 12 tribes, what's what? Right. So you remember that happened, right? The Jews come in, heard the gospel, many of them converted. After the death of Stephen, they scatter. And James writes this letter not to Jews at Jerusalem per se, or maybe let me say it this way, to those there alone, and not to just one specific audience in one particular location. Paul wrote to the church at Galatia. He wrote, now, by the way, he commended churches at times to do what? Hey, get a copy of that letter I sent down there at Thessalonica. Get a copy of that and take a look at it. But this one's specifically written to have a more distributive, go out for, I can't say that word, go out further than just one particular location. Specific audience of people, but let's distribute that out to those that are scattered abroad. And he sends greeting. And then he says, my brethren, count it all joy when what? Yeah, when you fall into diverse, varying, various temptations. And what's the reason for that? Why can you count that joy? Okay, so because if you do this right, the trying of your faith will work some patience. So how is it possible to find joy in the various trials and tribulations that we experience? How is that even a possibility?
Make us better.
Okay? They strengthen us and can make us better.
Means you're doing something right. They always say thieves won't break into empty houses. If you're getting attacked like that, you must be doing something right on the path. Otherwise, you wouldn't be a target.
Right. There would be no trial and temptation, right, if we weren't striving to honor and do what God says. Let's add the Matthew 5 text that I shared with you in the lesson sheets. Matthew chapter 5, verse 11. So this is Sermon on the Mount, right? And Jesus said, blessed are you when what? Men revile you, when they persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely. For my sake, by the way, it's an important qualifier in this verse, right? He isn't just talking about general, things people might say. He's specifically addressing things people say because we've chosen to be a follower of Jesus. That's the topic here. Not just mean things people say in general. That's not necessarily right, but it's not his topic. He's talking about things that people say, persecutions that come, reviling that comes for my sake, for the reasoning that you've chosen to serve Jesus. And he even tells us to do what in the midst of that in verse 12? Rejoice and be exceeding glad. Why? For great is your reward in heaven. And then he reminds us, we're not the only ones. This has been happening since anybody has chosen to be a believer and a follower in God. The prophets of old suffered the same kind of challenges, the same kinds of persecutions, the same kinds of trials. Yeah. So, and by the way, I don't think Jesus here, I don't think James in his messaging they're not trivializing reviling and persecutions and tribulations and challenge. They're not trivializing it. They're not saying, quit making a big fuss over that and it's not a big deal and that's not the message here at all. The message is, James, the trying of your faith worketh patience. When you come out the other side of these challenges and you maintain the integrity of your faith, you grow an ability to face the next and the next and the next one that's going to come. Rejoice in them. Find joy, because you can remember that there's reward at the end of this. If I'll face these things and I'll deal with and address with these challenges and stay steadfast through that process, there's benefit at the other end of this. And that's what we have to remind ourselves of. Whatever I suffer in the cause of Christ, whatever I experience because of the world's challenges, because of the faith that I'm striving to build, I'll just keep my eyes focused on the reward at the end of the process and allow that to encourage me and to keep me steadfast. Because who do you trust through that process? God, right? We trust God to carry us through that process. And we rely on Him to be able to at times help us with that patience that we need, to help us see how to overcome the trial that's in front of us, to stay steadfast in that relationship. James is going to do a lot of writing here, and it's going to be purposeful in encouraging us. How am I able to go through the persecutions, the revilings, the mockery? Oh, I'm just trying to serve the Lord, and I thought this was going to be easier, right? All I'm trying to do is be faithful to Jesus, and why are these people causing me so much heartache and trouble just because I'm trying to serve the Lord? And James is going to tell us how it is we can overcome all that, and how we win the battle over those challenges. So Lord willing, we'll come back and we'll have that, start having that conversation in more detail. Now that we've got kind of that backdrop set, we'll do that, Lord willing, on Sunday.